Imagine waking before dawn to the sound of hoofbeats. The air is cold. The prairie stretches endlessly in every direction. And in a moment that feels like a storm breaking over your life, everything you knew is gone. This is the story drawn from historical accounts of women captured during the conflicts of the 18th and 19th centuries on the North American frontier. It is not a tale of simple violence as older histories once told it, but one of survival, cultural collision, fear, adaptation, and sometimes unexpected transformation. To understand it, we must step into the world of the frontier. In the early decades of the frontier era, the land seemed to stretch without limit, an immense sea of grass that moved like water under the force of the wind. To those arriving from crowded towns and settled farms farther east, it appeared empty, silent, and waiting. But this impression was an illusion born from unfamiliarity. The plains were not vacant. They were alive with movement, memory, and meaning, home to societies that had shaped their lives around the rhythms of this environment for generations beyond counting. Long before wagon tracks marked the soil, networks of trails already crossed these grasslands. They were known by heart rather than by map, memorized through story and repetition. These paths followed water sources, seasonal hunting grounds, and gathering places where families reunited, traded goods, and renewed alliances. The land itself functioned as a kind of living archive. A bend in a river might recall an ancestral victory. A cluster of hills might be tied to a sacred origin story. A stand of cottonwood trees might signal both shelter and ceremony. For the people who lived there, survival depended not on controlling the land, but on understanding it. They did not try to force it into rigid patterns. Instead, they moved with it. The migrations of massive herds determined when camps were raised and taken down. The coming of storms dictated travel. Knowledge of plants, animals, and weather was passed carefully from elders to children, forming an education rooted in observation and respect. Every skill tracking, riding, preparing hides, constructing shelter was practical, but also cultural, reinforcing identity and belonging. Into this world came settlers, many driven by promises of land ownership, independence, or escape from hardship elsewhere. They carried with them tools of permanence: plows, lumber, fences, and the expectation that land should be divided into fixed parcels. Their worldview emphasized staying in one place, building structures meant to last, and reshaping the environment to match agricultural needs. Where indigenous communities saw a landscape to travel through, settlers saw property lines waiting to be drawn. The meeting of these two perspectives created friction almost immediately, though neither side fully understood the other. Settlers often believed they were entering unused territory because they did not see permanent towns or fenced fields. Indigenous inhabitants, in turn, saw newcomers altering hunting grounds, cutting timber, and introducing animals that competed with native species. Actions that settlers considered improvement could appear, to those already living there, as disruption or even desecration. Communication was limited, shaped by language barriers and mutual suspicion. Trade sometimes bridged the gap. At exchange sites, tools, cloth, and metal goods changed hands alongside food, animal products, and knowledge of the terrain. These encounters could be peaceful, even cooperative, yet they existed alongside rising tension, because each interaction occurred within a broader struggle over space and survival. The frontier was not governed by a single authority. It was a patchwork of isolated homesteads, scattered encampments, and distant military outposts, each separated by days of travel. Law, in any formal sense, was inconsistent. People relied on their families and neighbors for protection, which fostered both fierce independence and deep vulnerability. A farmstead might stand alone on the prairie, its nearest neighbor miles away. At night, the darkness was complete, broken only by starlight and the sound of wind moving through grass. Daily life for settlers was filled with relentless labor. Breaking the sod required enormous effort, as roots woven tightly together resisted the blade. Water had to be hauled, fuel had to be gathered, crops depended on unpredictable rainfall. Every success felt hard-earned, and every setback, drought, illness, or loss of livestock could threaten survival. This constant struggle fostered a mindset of endurance, but also fear of anything that might undo the fragile stability they were trying to build. Meanwhile, indigenous communities faced pressures of their own. The arrival of settlers altered migration routes and reduced access to key resources. Diseases introduced from distant populations spread with devastating speed, reshaping demographics and weakening established structures. Some groups adapted by increasing trade or negotiating passage agreements. Others resisted encroachment more directly, defending territories they considered essential to their future. Warfare on the plains differed from the large-scale battles familiar to European traditions. It was often fast, strategic, and personal. Raids could be acts of retaliation, attempts to reclaim goods, demonstrations of strength, or means of replacing losses within a community. These actions followed cultural rules and carried meanings that outsiders rarely understood. Courage, skill, and the ability to provide for one's people were valued above sheer destruction. The environment itself shaped how these conflicts unfolded. The plains offered little cover, so mobility became essential. Horsemanship transformed travel and warfare alike, allowing groups to cross astonishing distances in short periods. Riders developed an intimacy with their animals that outsiders sometimes marveled at, guiding them with subtle movements rather than force. Speed could determine success or failure, whether in hunting or in evasion. Weather added another layer of unpredictability. Sudden storms could erase tracks, scatter camps, or isolate travelers. Winters brought cutting winds that swept unhindered across the open land, freezing anything unprotected. Summers could be equally harsh, with heat shimmering above the grass and water sources shrinking under relentless sun. Those who lived there learned to read the sky as carefully as any written text. Despite the hardships, the plains were also places of extraordinary beauty. At dawn, light spilled across the horizon in colors that seemed to last forever. Herds moved like dark rivers across the distance. The night sky, unobstructed by buildings or smoke, revealed countless stars, creating a sense of scale that humbled even the most determined newcomers. Such moments could inspire awe, but they also reminded inhabitants old and new alike of how small human efforts were against such immensity. Cultural misunderstandings often deepened because each side interpreted the other through its own values. Settlers sometimes viewed mobility as rootlessness, failing to see it as a deliberate adaptation. Indigenous observers might interpret fences as signs of mistrust or selfishness, not realizing they represented a different agricultural logic. Without shared context, ordinary actions could appear threatening. Children growing up on the frontier absorbed these tensions early. They learned caution, but also curiosity. Stories circulated about encounters, some peaceful, others frightening, shaping imaginations long before individuals experienced such moments themselves. Oral traditions carried warnings, lessons, and moral guidance, reinforcing group identity in a landscape where uncertainty was constant. Trade goods became symbols of the changing world. Metal tools replaced stone implements. Cloth in vivid colors appeared alongside traditional materials. Firearms altered hunting and warfare, bringing both advantages and new dangers. These items moved along exchange networks that connected distant regions, demonstrating that even seemingly isolated communities were part of broader transformations. As years passed, the frontier did not remain static. Trails widened into roads. Temporary shelters gave way to more permanent structures. Animal populations shifted under pressure from increased hunting and habitat change. Each season carried signs that the balance of life on the plains was being renegotiated, though no one could yet see the final outcome. For individuals living through this era, history did not feel like a grand narrative. It felt like a series of immediate decisions: where to travel, how to protect family, when to trust strangers, and how to endure another winter. The vast political forces driving expansion or resistance were distant abstractions compared to the pressing realities of food, safety, and belonging. This was the environment in which moments of conflict and capture could occur. They were not isolated incidents, but expressions of a larger collision between ways of life. To understand those events, one must first grasp the complexity of the frontier itself, a place neither wholly wild nor fully settled, shaped by competing visions of how humans should live upon the land. The plains demanded resilience from everyone who entered them. They rewarded knowledge, punished arrogance, and exposed the limits of any culture that tried to dominate rather than adapt. In that demanding space, societies encountered one another not in theory, but face to face, carrying their fears, hopes, and traditions into an uncertain future. The moment of capture, for those who experienced it, rarely began as a clear or dramatic event. It often unfolded out of an ordinary dione that seemed no different from countless others. Morning chores had to be done, water had to be carried, fires needed tending. On isolated homesteads, routine was not simply habit, it was survival. Every task followed a rhythm shaped by necessity, and that rhythm gave people a sense of control in an environment that otherwise felt vast and unpredictable. Because these homes were often separated by miles of open land, there was little warning when danger approached. The prairie carried sound unevenly. Wind could swallow the noise of movement, or carry it too late to matter. Many accounts describe how the first sign of trouble was not sight, but confusion, dogs barking in agitation, livestock stirring, or an unfamiliar stillness that interrupted the normal cadence of the day. Then came motion, swift and undeniable. Riders could appear over a rise with startling speed, closing distances that seemed impossible only moments before. For families unused to organized defense, the suddenness created panic. There were no town bells to ring, no nearby militia to summon. Each household stood alone in that instant, forced to react without preparation. Chaos followed. People shouted to one another, sometimes without understanding what was being said. Children were gathered, tools dropped, doors barred or flung open depending on instinct rather than plan. The line between decision and reaction blurred. Time seemed to compress, as though events that lasted minutes were experienced as flashes of disconnected images. For the women who would later be taken captive, this was often the last moment they saw the life they recognized. The interior of a cabin, the shape of a familiar object, the sound of a loved one's voice. These details etched themselves into memory because everything afterward changed so completely. Capture did not feel like a single act, but like being swept into a current stronger than anything one could resist. Movement began almost immediately. Speed was essential for those conducting the raid, both to avoid retaliation and to place as much distance as possible between themselves and any potential pursuit. Captives were urged forward quickly, sometimes placed on horseback, sometimes required to walk until they could keep pace. The urgency allowed little time to comprehend what had happened. The landscape itself became part of the ordeal. What had once seemed expansive and even beautiful now felt disorienting. Without knowledge of direction or destination, the plains stretched endlessly, offering no landmarks that held meaning for the captive. The sameness of grass and sky created a sense of being unmoored, as though the world had lost its structure. Fear was constant during these first hours and days, but it was accompanied by exhaustion. Travel did not pause simply because someone was overwhelmed. The pace demanded endurance, and physical strain quickly replaced the initial shock. Blisters, thirst, and hunger became immediate realities. Even those accustomed to hard work found this journey different, because it lacked familiarity and control. Communication added another layer of uncertainty. Words spoken by the captors were often unintelligible to those taken. Tone and gesture became the only clues to meaning. A motion of the hand might signal where to sit, when to rise, or whether to continue moving. Misunderstandings were inevitable, deepening the sense of isolation. Night offered little relief. Camps established during travel were temporary, designed for practicality rather than comfort. The sounds of an unfamiliar environment replaced those of home. The shifting of animals, the murmur of voices in a language not understood, the wind pressing against the earth without obstruction. Sleep, when it came, was uneasy and fragmented. Yet within this disorientation, patterns slowly began to emerge. Even in situations of conflict, human beings rely on structure. Tasks were assigned, fires were built, food was prepared. These actions, though alien to the captive, followed an internal order. Observing that order was often the first step toward psychological survival, because it revealed that events were not random chaos but part of a functioning social world. The journey itself could last days or even longer, depending on distance and circumstance. During that time, captives confronted not only physical hardship but also the realization that rescue might not come. The frontier was too vast, the distances too great, for immediate recovery efforts to be certain. This recognition marked a turning point. Panic gradually gave way to a quieter, heavier awareness of reality. Many later accounts described this stage as one of emotional numbness. The mind, unable to sustain constant fear, began to narrow its focus to immediate needs. Taking the next step, drinking when water was offered, resting when allowed. Such adaptation was not surrender, but a form of endurance. It allowed individuals to function in circumstances that otherwise might have overwhelmed them completely. As travel continued, captives observed more details of the people around them. Clothing, tools, and behavior reflected a culture deeply attuned to mobility. Items were designed to be carried, assembled, and taken down quickly. Horses were handled with skill that suggested lifelong familiarity. Even simple actions, mounting, adjusting gear, navigating terrain demonstrated efficiency shaped by generations of experience. This gradual noticing did not erase fear, but it complicated it. The captors were no longer faceless threats, they became individuals performing recognizable human tasks. Some spoke calmly among themselves, others focused on practical concerns like route and supplies. The rhythms of daily life persisted even within the aftermath of violence. For the captive, this recognition could be deeply unsettling. It challenged the expectation that such an event existed outside normal human behavior. Instead, it revealed that the raid, however traumatic, was embedded within a broader cultural framework. Understanding that framework was not immediate, but the process of witnessing it had already begun. Environmental challenges reinforced this lesson. Weather shifted quickly on the plains, and every own captor and captive alike responded to it together. A sudden storm required collective action to secure shelter and animals. Cold nights demanded shared fires. Survival depended on cooperation within the group, regardless of how that group had been formed. Over time, the sharp boundary between before and after began to blur into a continuous present defined by travel and adjustment. Memories of home remained vivid, but they existed alongside the immediate demands of the new environment. The mind carried both realities at once, struggling to reconcile them. This stage of captivity was marked above all by uncertainty. Nothing felt permanent. Each day brought new movement, new terrain, new expectations. Yet within that uncertainty lay the beginning of transformation, not necessarily acceptance, but the slow recognition that survival required engagement with the unfamiliar world rather than withdrawal from it. The experience was neither a single moment nor a simple narrative. It was an unfolding process shaped by fear, endurance, observation, and the relentless passage of time across an immense landscape. Understanding that process reveals how capture was not only an act of violence, but also the beginning of a complex human journey through dislocation, adaptation, and the search for stability in circumstances beyond one's choosing. Arrival within the community did not come with a clear announcement or ceremony, at least not at first. After days of travel across open country, the approach to a settled encampment might appear gradual, almost indistinguishable from the journey itself. What began as scattered signs, distant figures, grazing horses, thin columns of smoke rising into the sky slowly resolved into the presence of an organized village. For someone entering it as a captive, the realization could be both relieving and frightening. The constant motion had ended, but uncertainty had not. The encampment was not arranged randomly. Every structure, every pathway, and every activity reflected patterns developed over generations. Lodges were positioned with awareness of wind direction, access to water, and the needs of communal life. Space existed for animals, for work, for gathering, and for ceremony. To an outsider, it might seem fluid or temporary compared to wooden towns or fenced farms, yet it possessed an internal logic just as deliberate as any permanent settlement. The first sensation many captives described was the sheer level of activity. Life here was not idle. People moved with purpose, tending fires, preparing food, repairing tools, watching children, and managing animals. Conversations flowed constantly, sometimes animated, sometimes quiet, but always connected to the tasks at hand. The sense of collective labor stood in contrast to the relative isolation of frontier homesteads, where a single family might struggle through its work alone. Observation became unavoidable. Without understanding the language, a newcomer relied on sight and sound to interpret meaning. Hands signaled instructions. Expressions conveyed approval or correction. Repetition demonstrated expectations. Learning began not through formal teaching but through immersion. Every movement served as an example, every mistake as a lesson. Food preparation offered one of the clearest introductions to this new rhythm. Meals were not individual affairs taken quickly between chores. They were coordinated efforts involving several people, each responsible for a specific stage of cutting, drying, cooking, or distributing. The work demanded both strength and patience, particularly when processing large quantities of meat or preparing hides. It required techniques unfamiliar to someone raised in a different tradition, yet those techniques revealed an intricate understanding of preservation and resource management in a land where waste could be dangerous. Clothing, too, reflected adaptation to environment rather than fashion alone. Garments were crafted for mobility, warmth, and durability, shaped from materials gathered through hunting and trade. The process of making them was labor-intensive, involving scraping, stretching, softening, and sewing by hand. Participating in such work required learning new tools and new gestures, gradually building familiarity with textures and methods that once seemed strange. Children moved freely throughout the camp, watched not only by parents but by relatives and neighbors. Caregiving was shared, reinforcing the idea that responsibility extended beyond the immediate household. For someone accustomed to strict divisions between family units, this collective attention could feel unusual. Yet it also meant that no one functioned entirely alone. Tasks overlapped. Roles shifted depending on need. Time itself seemed measured differently. There were no clocks marking hours. Activities followed natural cue angle of the sun, the readiness of food, the approach of weather, the seasonal behavior of animals. This relationship with time created a sense of continuity between human effort and the surrounding landscape. Work began when conditions demanded it and paused when those demands changed. Communication remained a challenge, but language slowly revealed patterns. Certain sounds repeated in familiar contexts. Gestures paired consistently with specific actions. Even without full comprehension, meaning accumulated piece by piece. Understanding often arrived not in sudden clarity but in gradual recognition, like assembling fragments into a larger picture. Authority within the community did not always appear in the rigid hierarchies familiar to outsiders. Leadership could shift depending on circumstance, one person guiding a hunt, another overseeing camp organization, another offering spiritual direction. Respect was earned through knowledge, generosity, or skill rather than imposed solely by position. Witnessing this flexibility required rethinking assumptions about how societies functioned. Daily survival relied heavily on cooperation. Water had to be carried, fires maintained, materials gathered from surrounding areas. Each task connected to another, forming an interdependent system. If one element failed, others felt the strain. This structure encouraged participation because contribution was both expected and necessary. The environment remained ever present. Wind pressed against the lodges, carrying scents of grass and smoke. Weather changes required immediate response, adjusting coverings, securing belongings, preparing for temperature shifts. Unlike enclosed towns, where walls separated people from the elements, life here remained intertwined with natural forces. Awareness of the sky, the ground, and distant movement became second nature. Animals played an essential role, particularly horses, which were treated not merely as tools but as valued partners in mobility and survival. Their care demanded attention, feeding, grooming, monitoring for injury. Skill in handling them signaled competence and reliability. Observing this relationship revealed a deep respect for the animal's importance within daily life. Gradually, routine replaced the disorientation of arrival. Tasks repeated from day to day, creating familiarity. The once unfamiliar sights and sounds became predictable markers of morning, afternoon, and evening. While the sense of displacement never disappeared entirely, it coexisted with growing practical knowledge of how to function within this environment. Social interactions expanded as well. Even without fluent speech, shared work fostered recognition. A nod of approval, an offered tool or assistance during a difficult task communicated acceptance more clearly than words. Relationships formed through cooperation rather than formal introduction. Moments of rest revealed another dimension of community life. Stories were told, sometimes accompanied by gestures that made their meaning partially accessible even to outsiders. Laughter moved through groups, easing tensions built by labor. These gatherings reinforced bonds and transmitted memory, preserving knowledge through oral tradition rather than written record. Spiritual practices, though not always fully understood by newcomers, underscored the connection between people, land, and belief. Ceremonies marked transitions, honored ancestors, or sought guidance. Participation could range from observation to involvement, depending on circumstances, but their presence demonstrated that survival was viewed not only in physical terms, but also in moral and spiritual balance. Adapting to this world required more than learning tasks, it demanded adjusting perception. Actions once interpreted through fear or confusion began to reveal purpose. Structures that seemed temporary showed resilience precisely because they could move and change. Community strength lay not in fixed buildings, but in shared knowledge carried wherever people traveled. Memory of the previous life remained, sometimes painfully vivid. Yet the immediacy of daily responsibility left little space for reflection during working hours. Practical needs took precedence, anchoring attention in the present. Over time, this focus helped bridge the gap between unfamiliar surroundings and the necessity of endurance. What emerged was neither complete assimilation nor unchanging separation, but a complex middle state. The captive existed within the community's rhythms while still carrying the imprint of another world. Each day added new understanding, not through deliberate transformation, but through participation in the ordinary acts that sustained everyone there. This stage of captivity illustrated a fundamental truth of human experience. Societies that appear radically different from the outside often share underlying structures of care, labor, belief, and adaptation. The forms varied, the meanings differed, but the need to organize life in response to environment and relationship remained universal. Living within that reality required resilience of mind as much as body. It meant learning to navigate unfamiliar expectations while recognizing patterns of humanity beneath them. Through work, observation, and time, what had begun as a place of fear slowly became a landscape of lived experiences, still foreign, still complicated, but no longer entirely unknowable. In many cases, the status of a captive did not remain undefined for long. After the initial shock of arrival and the first days of adjustment, a more deliberate process often began on that determined how the individual would exist within the community. This process could be confusing to an outsider because it did not resemble imprisonment as commonly imagined. There were no cells, no chains, no formal declarations of servitude. Instead, there were gestures, conversations, and actions that gradually redefined the captive's place among the people. Loss played an important role in this transformation. Communities that lived close to the uncertainties of war, disease, and environmental hardship were intimately familiar with grief. When a family lost a member, the absence was not merely emotional, it disrupted daily responsibilities and the continuity of knowledge passed between generations. In such circumstances, incorporating a newcomer could be seen as a way to restore balance. The act was not viewed simply as taking someone from another world, but as filling a space that had been painfully emptied. For the captive, this shift could feel bewildering. The same people who had participated in a violent raid might now offer clothing, food, or guidance. The contrast between those experiences created emotional confusion. Fear did not disappear overnight, nor did trust appear easily. Yet small acts offered blanket against the cold, assistance during work, a place beside others during meals began to alter the tone of daily life. Names often marked one of the first symbolic changes. A new name might be given, sometimes reflecting qualities the community observed or hoped the person would embody. This renaming was not meant to erase the past in a cruel sense, but to signal inclusion within a new network of relationships. In cultures where names carried deep significance, the gesture indicated recognition and responsibility rather than anonymity. Clothing also held meaning beyond practicality. Being dressed in garments similar to those worn by others represented participation in shared identity. The materials, patterns, and construction connected the wearer to collective traditions shaped by environment and history. Learning to care for and repair such clothing required instruction, which created further opportunities for interaction and gradual acceptance. Work formed the foundation of belonging. Responsibilities were not assigned arbitrarily but aligned with the needs of the group. Preparing food, maintaining shelter, tending animals, or crafting essential items all contributed to survival. Through these tasks, a former captive demonstrated willingness to participate, while the community observed reliability and effort. Contribution became a language that transcended words. Relationships within families were structured through kinship terms that extended beyond strict biological ties. Individuals addressed one another using words that expressed roles: mother, sister, aunt, or daughter, even when no blood relation existed. For someone entering this system, such language could feel strange at first, yet it reinforced the idea that identity was shaped through connection rather than isolation. The emotional dimension of adoption was rarely simple. Grieving families might project memories of lost loved ones onto the newcomer, creating expectations that could be difficult to meet. At the same time, the adopted individual carried memories of her own family, producing a layered sense of attachment and displacement. These overlapping emotions did not cancel each other, they coexisted, sometimes uneasily. Instruction in daily skills often came through demonstration rather than explanation. Elders showed how to prepare materials, how to store food for winter, how to recognize subtle environmental signs. Learning was practical and immediate, embedded in action. Mistakes were corrected through repetition, not punishment, because mastery benefited everyone. Over time, participation in routine activities reduced the sense of being watched as an outsider. Familiarity grew through shared effort. Laughter during work, conversation around fires, and mutual dependence during travel fostered a rhythm that felt less like supervision and more like cooperation. Acceptance was measured less by formal statements than by the absence of distance. Spiritual practices could deepen this integration. Ceremonies acknowledged transitions, honored memory, and sought harmony within the community. Inclusion in such events indicated recognition of one's place within the group's moral and symbolic universe. Even when meanings were not fully understood, participation conveyed trust and expectation. The environment reinforced these relationships. Survival on the plains demanded collective action no individual could endure alone for long. Storms, scarcity, and movement required coordination. Shared vulnerability strengthened bonds, making distinctions between origin and adoption less relevant than the ability to rely on one another. Yet internal conflict often persisted. Memories of the former life surfaced unexpectedly in dreams, in familiar gestures, in the sound of a language once spoken daily. These recollections could bring comfort or sorrow, depending on circumstance. Adaptation did not erase identity, it layered new experiences over existing ones, creating a complex sense of self. Children within the community sometimes played a subtle role in easing this transition. Their curiosity was direct and unguarded, and their willingness to include newcomers in games or tasks introduced moments of normalcy. Through them, interactions became less formal, allowing relationships to grow naturally. As seasons passed, the adopted individual gained knowledge that once seemed unreachable: how to travel efficiently across open land, how to prepare resources for harsh weather, how to interpret signs in the natural world. Competence brought confidence, and confidence reshaped how others responded. Respect followed demonstrated ability. The concept of freedom itself could take on new meaning in this context. While the individual had not chosen to arrive, participation in communal life often came with expectations balanced by forms of autonomous movement within the camp, responsibility for certain tasks, involvement in decisions affecting daily routine. These experiences challenged earlier assumptions about captivity as a state defined solely by restriction. Communication gradually expanded as language barriers diminished. Understanding grew through listening, repetition, and context. Words that once sounded indistinct acquired meaning tied to actions and relationships. Language learning was not merely practical, it opened pathways to humor, storytelling, and emotional expression that had previously been inaccessible. The passage of time altered perception. What initially felt temporary could stretch into months or years, allowing habits to solidify. Seasonal cycles repeated, creating familiarity where once there had been disorientation. With each cycle, memories of the arrival receded slightly, replaced by the immediacy of present responsibilities. Still, belonging remained layered rather than absolute. The adopted individual existed between histories, carrying traces of two cultural worlds. This position could foster resilience, as navigating difference required adaptability and observation. It also demanded emotional negotiation, balancing remembrance with participation. Community members, for their part, adjusted as well. Acceptance was not automatic, it developed through shared experiences and mutual reliance. Over time, distinctions between origin and membership often became less emphasized than loyalty, contribution, and trust demonstrated in daily life. This process of adoption reveals a perspective on identity grounded less in unchangeable boundaries and more in relationships sustained over time. It illustrates how societies facing loss and uncertainty sometimes responded not by exclusion, but by incorporation, seeking continuity through transformation. For the person at the center of that process, the experience was neither a simple erasure of the past nor an uncomplicated embrace of the present. It was a gradual weaving together of memory and adaptation, shaped by necessity, emotion, and the enduring human capacity to create connection even under the most difficult circumstances. Life on the plains demanded a level of endurance and adaptability that few outsiders could immediately comprehend. Once the initial shock of arrival and the process of adoption had passed, captives found themselves immersed in a world where every day required effort, skill, and vigilance. Survival was not an abstract concept, it was an ongoing negotiation with the land, the weather, the animals, and the people around them. Each action carried consequences, and the margin for error was often razor thin. The demands of daily existence became the primary reality, shaping routines, relationships, and even the perception of time itself. From dawn, the day was filled with work that was both necessary and structured, though its order was guided more by practical need than formal authority. Fire had to be built or maintained, both for warmth and for cooking. Without fire, nights could be deadly cold and food could not be safely prepared or preserved. Water had to be collected and managed carefully, as wells and streams could be distant or scarce. Food procurement involved not only preparation of game already hunted but also collection of edible plants, herbs, and grains available in the surrounding environment. Each of these tasks required knowledge: when to act, how to act, and in what order to complete activities to ensure the well-being of the entire community. One of the most physically demanding responsibilities involved the care of animals, especially horses. Horses were central to life on the plains, essential for mobility, hunting, and transportation of goods. Their care required attention to feeding, grooming, and monitoring for signs of illness or injury. Captives quickly learned that horses could not be treated as simple tools. Their well-being directly affected the survival of the group. Developing an intuitive understanding of animal behavior became a critical skill, as did the ability to ride efficiently across vast, open terrain, often in extreme weather. Travel was another constant aspect of daily life. Unlike stationary farms or towns, the communities of the plains moved according to the seasons and the migration of buffalo and other game. Captives were expected to keep pace on foot or horseback, carrying personal belongings and sometimes assisting with communal supplies. These journeys could span many miles across terrain that shifted from grasslands to rivers, hills, and forests, each presenting unique challenges. Mastery of navigation, endurance, and balance became essential. The physical toll was immense: blistered feet, sore muscles, and constant exposure to the elements. Yet each challenge also offered opportunities to learn, adapt, and integrate into the rhythms of life. Food preparation was both labor-intensive and skill-dependent. Processing meat from hunting required knowledge of butchering techniques, drying methods, and preservation strategies to ensure supplies lasted through lean seasons. Hides had to be scraped, stretched, and tanned, then fashioned into clothing, blankets, and shelter materials. For someone unfamiliar with these processes, the work was grueling. Yet it was also instructive, offering lessons in resourcefulness, patience, and attention to detail. Every successful task reinforced the sense that survival depended on competence, observation, and a willingness to engage fully in communal life. Daily life was not only physically demanding but also required careful attention to environmental cues. Weather patterns could change abruptly. Storms brought rain or snow that could jeopardize camps, travel, and supplies. The shifting of wind indicated the approach of weather or signaled the presence of distant animals. Plants and wildlife offered signs of seasonal change or the availability of resources. Learning to interpret these signals was crucial. Those who failed to respond appropriately could endanger themselves and others. For captives, these lessons were absorbed gradually through observation, participation, and the guidance of experienced community members. Hygiene and health were constant concerns. Water needed to be clean, food properly prepared, and wounds promptly treated. Illness could spread rapidly in a mobile camp, where individuals lived in close quarters and relied on shared resources. Knowledge of medicinal plants, natural remedies, and preventive practices was passed down orally and through demonstration. Captives had to internalize these lessons not only for their own survival but for the survival of the community. The connection between individual care and communal well-being became immediately apparent. Social dynamics intertwined with daily labor. Tasks were often completed in groups, fostering cooperation, communication, and mutual responsibility. Assistance was given to those struggling with new skills or heavy work, and guidance was provided in ways that reinforced hierarchy and respect without coercion. Relationships were built through shared effort, helping with a heavy load, offering instruction, or sharing food. Trust was earned in the context of practical necessity. Performance in daily tasks signaled reliability and competence, which in turn influenced one's standing within the community. Rest and leisure were incorporated within these routines, though they were limited and often pragmatic. Even moments of relaxation served a function, allowing for the sharing of knowledge, the reinforcement of bonds, and the maintenance of morale. Children, in particular, played a role in creating continuity and fostering social cohesion. Their games and interactions provided opportunities for captives to observe cultural norms in less formal settings, offering insights into etiquette, storytelling, and communal values. Education in this context was deeply experiential. Captives learned not from written texts but from hands-on engagement. Tasks were demonstrated repeatedly, corrected through practice, and contextualized by elders and peers. Over time, familiarity with these processes created competence, confidence, and gradually a sense of belonging. Knowledge became inseparable from action. To understand the land, the resources, and the people was to participate fully in the rhythms of daily life. The relationship to time evolved as well. Without clocks or rigid schedules, activities were governed by natural cues: sunrise, sunset, animal behavior, and seasonal change. Tasks were prioritized according to immediate need, and efficiency became a form of self-discipline. This cyclical understanding of time linked human effort to environmental conditions and underscored the interconnectedness of work, survival, and community cohesion. Spiritual and cultural practices were interwoven with daily routines. Ceremonies, rituals, and communal observances punctuated periods of labor, reinforcing moral codes, social roles, and connection to the land. Participation, even in observation, deepened integration and provided a sense of continuity. Captives came to understand that work and ritual were not separate domains, but parts of a holistic approach to life that balanced physical, social, and spiritual needs. As competence increased, the captive's role expanded. Responsibilities grew in scope and complexity, reflecting trust earned through demonstrated skill and reliability. This expansion of duties reinforced integration into the social fabric of the community. It also provided psychological stability. Mastering skills and fulfilling responsibilities allowed captives to regain agency in a world where they had initially felt powerless. Adaptation extended beyond physical skills. Mental resilience developed through repeated exposure to challenges, observation of social norms, and reflection on personal performance. Captives learned to anticipate needs, interpret subtle cues from others, and make decisions within unfamiliar frameworks. This cognitive flexibility became as important as physical strength in ensuring survival. The ongoing demand of work fostered self-reliance within a cooperative structure. Captives were simultaneously dependent on others for instruction and protection, and responsible for contributing meaningfully to communal well-being. This balance encouraged the development of practical intelligence, emotional regulation, and situational awareness. Success in these areas reinforced identity within the community, while gradually softening the sharp distinction between outsider and member. Every task carried a moral dimension as well. Neglect could harm not only the individual but the entire group. Conversely, diligence and skill contributed to collective stability. Through daily engagement, captives internalized cultural values, including responsibility, reciprocity, and respect for both people and the land. These values were lived rather than taught, embedded in the fabric of ordinary existence. Over weeks, months, and years, the rhythm of labor, travel, and ritual created a sense of structure. Patterns of work and rest, of task and ceremony repeated according to natural and social cycles. The formerly unfamiliar environment became intelligible through repeated experience. Captives developed competence, confidence, and even mastery in areas that initially seemed insurmountable. The process was gradual, cumulative, and transformative. Environmental challenges continued to shape behavior. Drought, severe cold, or unexpected storms required coordination, improvisation, and resilience. The lessons of survival were reinforced in real time. Failing to prepare for a cold snap could lead to frostbite or illness. Misjudging the availability of water could threaten both personal and communal well-being. Awareness of risk became instinctive, as individuals learned to anticipate and mitigate challenges before they became crises. Over time, the captive's identity began to adapt. Physical skill, knowledge of the land, participation in labor, and integration into social networks combined to create a sense of belonging that existed alongside memories of the life left behind. The relationship between personal history and new experiences became layered, creating a complex sense of self shaped by endurance, observation, and contribution. The demands of daily survival on the plains illustrate the intersection of environment, culture, and human resilience. Life was not static or predictable. Each day required continuous attention, judgment, and labor. Success depended on physical strength, mental acuity, emotional flexibility, and social intelligence. Captives who survived and adapted did so by learning to function fully within these overlapping systems, mastering tasks, reading the land, and navigating the human networks that sustained life. Ultimately, the relentless demands of work, travel, and observation were not merely hardships, they were instruments of transformation. Through participation in daily life, captives acquired skills, insight, and understanding that reshaped their identities. Physical labor fostered endurance, communal tasks cultivated trust, and adaptation to the environment built both competence and resilience. These experiences were deeply formative, demonstrating how immersion in a demanding, dynamic world could produce mastery, self-reliance, and an intricate understanding of both people and place. Life on the plains required constant negotiation between individual capability and collective need, between immediate survival and long-term adaptation. It was a process that reshaped not only behavior but perception, emphasizing interdependence, skill, and awareness as foundations for living. For a captive, the daily reality of survival became the axis around which all other experiences revolved. By engaging fully with the demands of the environment, participating in communal work, and internalizing social and cultural norms, they moved from shock and fear to competence, from dependence to agency, and ultimately toward a nuanced integration within a community that demanded both endurance and engagement in every aspect of life. Return from captivity was rarely as simple as crossing a river or stepping back into a familiar home. For the women who had spent months or years living within a new community, the experience of leaving carried its own complexities, often as profound as the initial trauma of being taken. Time spent adapting to new customs, learning new skills, and integrating into a social network shaped perceptions, loyalties, and identity in ways that could not be undone simply by physically moving back to the world they had left behind. The process of reintegration highlighted how captivity was not merely an interruption of life, but a transformative journey that left lasting imprints on body, mind, and spirit. The very act of returning often involved negotiation, sometimes facilitated by family members, traders, or military authorities. Communication between the captive and her original community was usually mediated by intermediaries, and the conditions of return could be complex. Some captives were exchanged as part of formal agreements between tribes and settlers, sometimes involving trade goods or other forms of negotiation. Others were rescued in the aftermath of conflicts, their return contingent on military intervention or diplomatic effort. The process itself underscored the recognition by both sides that captivity was not solely a criminal act, but part of a broader web of social, cultural, and political realities on the frontier. Yet the return journey was only the first step. The physical act of moving back into familiar territory did not automatically restore the sense of security, identity, or belonging that the captive had once known. Time spent in a different culture, especially one as immersive and demanding as that of the Plains communities, altered daily habits, survival skills, and social understanding. A woman who had once relied entirely on her family for support had learned to hunt, process hides, navigate the plains, ride long distances on horseback, and participate in collective labor. These abilities, developed out of necessity, now existed alongside memories of the life she had left behind. The psychological challenges of return were often profound. Reintegration required adjusting not only to the physical environment, but also to social expectations that had changed little during her absence. Customs, gender roles, household routines, and even the expectations of personal demeanor could feel constricting compared to the relative autonomy, responsibility, and respect the woman had gained in captivity. Those who had been young when captured often had grown into adults, shaped by the experiences and expectations of another society, creating a dissonance between who they were now and the roles their original families had envisioned for them. Emotionally, the return was rarely a straightforward relief. Longing for home and fear for safety had defined the initial period of captivity, but over time bonds formed with the captors, adoptive families, or peers in the community. Emotional attachment, however complex, was real. In some cases, a woman had been adopted as a daughter, sister, or aunt, and her labor, companionship, and presence had become valued within the household. The act of leaving could therefore evoke grief, guilt, or ambivalence, complicating the simplistic narrative of rescue or liberation. Identity itself became fluid and layered. A woman might find that she no longer fit neatly into the social structures of her original home. The skills, habits, and perspectives gained during captivity, hunting, knowledge of the land, interpersonal negotiation, and cultural practices were not always understood or valued by those she had returned to. Conversely, her original community expected her to conform to pre-existing norms and roles. This tension could produce isolation or frustration as the individual navigated the liminal space between two worlds. Historical records offer examples of this complexity. Some women chose to return to the communities in which they had been held, even when offered a chance to reintegrate fully into settler society. Their decision reflected not only the bonds formed over time but also an understanding of identity that transcended the simple binary of captive and free. The world they had entered, initially terrifying and alien, had become home in practical, social, and emotional terms. The choice to remain or return thus highlighted the adaptive flexibility of human identity and the profound impact of lived experience on belonging. For those who did reintegrate, the process required significant effort on multiple levels. Practical skills had to be adapted to new contexts. Food preparation, clothing construction, and travel practices developed for a nomadic, resource-focused society might not translate directly into the sedentary lifestyle of a homestead. Knowledge of the natural world, finely attuned to the plains and its season rhythms, could feel irrelevant or even undervalued in farmland or forested regions. Relearning the norms of social behavior, hierarchy, and gendered expectations demanded conscious attention and negotiation, often causing tension within families and communities. Emotional reintegration was equally demanding. Memory of the people, places, and experiences from captivity did not fade easily. Dreams, recollections, and emotional ties could resurface unexpectedly, influencing behavior, thought patterns, and relationships. At the same time, the expectations of one's original family could conflict with these internal experiences, producing stress, confusion, or even resentment. Women had to reconcile the need for survival with the desire for acceptance, forging a path that allowed for both continuity of self and adaptation to renewed circumstances. The social dimension of reintegration often involved negotiation with multiple layers of community. Family, neighbors, and local authorities all held opinions on the appropriate treatment of a returning captive. In some cases, women were celebrated and reintegrated as heroic figures, their endurance and adaptability admired. In others, suspicion, fear, or resentment complicated acceptance. The lived reality of captivity disrupted preconceived notions of identity, and returning women were sometimes viewed through the lens of difference, regardless of their prior social position. The passage of time magnified these effects. Months or years spent immersed in another culture had changed habits, language, and cognition. Even subtle behaviors, posture, gestures, speech patterns, decision-making styles could signal otherness. Reintegration required patience, negotiation, and often a redefinition of roles within the family and community. Those who succeeded demonstrated remarkable resilience, balancing the lessons and skills gained during captivity with the social norms and expectations of their original homes. Beyond personal adaptation, reintegration carried broader social implications. Returning captives could act as conduits for knowledge exchange, transmitting skills, understanding of terrain, or cultural practices acquired during their time with the other community. This transfer of knowledge could influence hunting techniques, resource management, or social organization within the settler or home community. In this way, captivity experiences, while traumatic, could inadvertently shape the evolution of frontier societies. The return experience also emphasized the long-term effects of trauma and adaptation on psychological development. Women who had been captured often demonstrated heightened situational awareness, emotional resilience, and problem-solving abilities, reflecting both the demands of survival and the responsibility they assumed within the adoptive community. These skills, while advantageous in some contexts, could create tension when social expectations assumed passivity or traditional roles, highlighting the ways in which extreme experiences can recalibrate human behavior and social dynamics. In some cases, reintegration involved formal or informal mediation. Elders, intermediaries, or community leaders might assist in negotiating roles, responsibilities, or expectations for the returning woman. These processes underscored the recognition that the experience of captivity was not an isolated personal event, but one with social consequences affecting multiple parties. The negotiation of identity, labor, and belonging became a shared concern, requiring flexibility, understanding, and sometimes compromise. For those who remained connected to their former adoptive families, relationships could persist across distance and time. Letters, visits, or stories maintained emotional bonds, demonstrating that integration into one community did not necessarily erase attachments to another. This reality further complicated the notion of home, illustrating that identity and belonging were not fixed but negotiated continuously through experience, memory, and social interaction. Ultimately, the process of return revealed that captivity was not merely a temporary interruption in a linear life narrative. It was transformative, creating new capabilities, perspectives, and social understandings. Whether a woman chose to remain with her adoptive community or to reintegrate into her original home, the experience reshaped her identity profoundly. Survival, adaptation, and integration produced skills and resilience that would influence not only personal trajectories but also the social fabric of the communities she touched. This period of reintegration also underscores a broader historical truth. Human experiences of displacement and cultural transition are rarely reducible to simple categories of victim and rescuer. The psychological, social, and practical effects of immersion in a different world reverberate long after the physical movement is complete. The women who return from captivity exemplify the complex interplay between trauma, adaptation, and agency, demonstrating how individuals navigate change, reconcile conflicting loyalties, and redefine belonging in response to circumstances beyond their control. In reflecting on these experiences, it becomes clear that the frontier was not merely a site of conquest or settlement, but also a space of human transformation. Captivity and return reveal the fluidity of identity, the resilience of the human spirit, and the capacity to navigate complex social landscapes. Each woman's story contributes to a richer understanding of history, not as a series of events and dates, but as lived experience shaped by adaptation, endurance, and the negotiation of self within multiple worlds. The legacy of these experiences continues to inform historical understanding of frontier life, demonstrating that the human capacity for adaptation often emerges most vividly under extreme circumstances. Captivity in this sense was not simply a story of loss or trauma. It was also a story of learning, survival, and transformation, with consequences that extended far beyond the immediate moment of return. It reminds us that identity is neither static nor singular, but a dynamic product of experience, environment, and the relationships that sustain life. The process of reintegration, with its challenges and triumphs, underscores the intricate ways in which human beings navigate the intersections of culture, survival, and belonging. For women who experienced capture, life after return was not a simple restoration of a former world, but a reweaving of histories, skills, and relationships that reflected both continuity and change. In this light, the story of captivity and return is not merely one of victimhood and rescue, but of endurance, adaptation, and the enduring complexity of human life on the frontier. These experiences illuminate broader patterns of cultural interaction, survival strategy, and identity formation in frontier societies. They highlight how individuals navigate liminal spaces between worlds, adapting to new demands while retaining aspects of previous identity, and reveal the profound ways in which human resilience manifests under extreme circumstances. Through these stories, historians gain insight into the lived realities of the frontier, the adaptability of the human mind and body, and the social structures that supported survival and belonging in challenging, dynamic environments. By considering the totality of these experiences, the initial capture, the demands of daily survival, the adoption into a new society, and the complex process of return, we begin to appreciate the nuanced reality of frontier life. The journeys of these women were defined not solely by fear or hardship, but by their capacity to navigate uncertainty, develop expertise, form social bonds, and reconstruct a sense of self across two worlds. In understanding their stories, we gain a deeper recognition of the complexity, resilience, and adaptability that human beings bring to even the most challenging circumstances, and the ways in which history is shaped not only by events but by the lived experiences of those who endure them. Following the period of return and reintegration, many women found that the experiences of captivity and adaptation had left enduring effects that shaped the rest of their lives. Even after physically leaving the community that had once held them, the lessons learned, the skills acquired, and the bonds formed continued to influence their daily decisions, perceptions, and relationships. Part 7 of this story examines the long-term consequences of such experiences, the psychological, social, and cultural transformations that captivity imposed, and the ways in which survival had reshaped not only their abilities but also their sense of self and place in the world. The first and perhaps most immediate effect was a profound change in personal resilience. Survival in an unfamiliar and often hostile environment required constant awareness, strategic thinking, and adaptability. A woman who had once relied primarily on family or community structures for guidance had been thrust into a situation where she needed to make split-second decisions that could affect her survival. Over time, this cultivated a level of self-reliance and confidence that was both empowering and, in some ways, disorienting when she returned to the more predictable routines of her original home. She had learned that her actions could directly influence outcomes in ways that were immediate and often dramatic, a lesson that would inform her approach to problem-solving and interpersonal dynamics for years to come. Alongside resilience came practical skills that could not be unlearned. Mastery of survival techniques such as tracking, horseback riding, hunting, and food preservation became deeply ingrained. These abilities were no longer abstract, they were second nature, forming part of a woman's daily approach to life. Even in circumstances where these skills were no longer immediately necessary within a household or a settled community, they remained as markers of competence, independence, and the capacity to navigate challenging environments. Some women would use these skills to assert agency within their family or community, demonstrating that they had capabilities far beyond what their original circumstances had required. Social awareness and emotional intelligence were also profoundly shaped by the experience of captivity. Life in an adoptive community demanded not only physical endurance but also nuanced understanding of interpersonal dynamics, cultural norms, and group expectations. Captives observed the subtleties of communication, from gestures to tone to social hierarchy, and learned to navigate relationships with skill and tact. These abilities acquired under conditions of necessity carried over into post-captivity life, often giving women a heightened sensitivity to social cues, a capacity for empathy, and an ability to manage complex relationships in ways that were less common among their peers. Yet this heightened awareness could also create tension. Women who had experienced captivity sometimes found themselves at odds with family members or communities that did not understand the depth or context of their experiences. Expectations of conformity to previous roles, daughter, wife, sister, clashed with the independence, assertiveness, and competence developed during captivity. Navigating these conflicts required negotiation, diplomacy, and occasionally quiet resistance. The women who succeeded in this negotiation often emerged not only integrated into their original communities, but also recognized for the unique knowledge and perspective they brought back. Memory played a critical role in shaping identity after captivity. Events, routines, and relationships from the adoptive community did not fade, they remained as vivid recollections that influenced thought and behavior. Dreams, for instance, often reflected experiences from captivity, replaying sequences of movement, work, or social interaction. Emotional responses could be triggered by situations reminiscent of past experiences, ranging from subtle cues in clothing or objects to more profound reminders of responsibility, danger, or belonging. These memories required emotional processing, sometimes manifesting in reflection, storytelling, or sharing of experience with trusted confidants. In this way, captivity became a lens through which life was understood, interpreted, and navigated long after the physical return. Cultural adaptation, too, left its imprint. Skills and habits learned in the adoptive community, methods of preparing food, organizing labor, interpreting environmental cues often persisted, even when returning to a settled or agrarian lifestyle. Clothing practices, methods of preserving meat or hides, and approaches to child rearing or community cooperation could reflect a blending of learned and inherited traditions. This blending was sometimes celebrated as ingenuity, but could also be met with skepticism by those unfamiliar with the context of its origin. Over time, however, these integrated practices enriched both the individual's life and, occasionally, the practices of her family or community. The psychological dimension of these long-term effects was profound. Captivity, adaptation, and return constituted a series of extreme stressors, each shaping perception, cognition, and emotional regulation. Women often developed acute situational awareness, heightened problem-solving abilities, and resilience to uncertainty. At the same time, they could experience lingering trauma responses, flashbacks, hypervigilance, or anxiety that required continuous management. Coping strategies developed during captivity, as focusing on immediate tasks, observation of patterns, or reliance on ritual continued to serve them in everyday life, providing a framework for stability in situations that might otherwise provoke distress. Relationships formed after captivity were often influenced by these experiences as well. Bonds with family members could be tested by differences in understanding, perspective, and approach to problem solving. Friendships and alliances could be shaped by the recognition of resilience and competence, sometimes fostering admiration or deference from peers. In some cases, women assumed mentoring roles, teaching skills or insights gained from their experiences to younger generations, thereby transmitting knowledge and values beyond their immediate survival. These roles reinforced social identity and allowed women to transform traumatic experiences into constructive contributions. Spiritual and moral perspectives were also affected. Many women integrated lessons from adoptive communities, including approaches to ritual, respect for the land, or ethical frameworks surrounding responsibility and cooperation. These perspectives could influence decision-making, parenting, and leadership within their original communities. They also created a richer, more nuanced worldview, integrating knowledge and practice from multiple cultural contexts. Such integration required reflection, discernment, and a capacity to navigate differences without losing coherence of self. Identity itself became layered and multidimensional. Women were no longer solely defined by the roles they held before capture. They were shaped by experiences that demanded autonomy, problem-solving, and adaptation. They carried dual narratives, one from the life they had known and one from the life they had been forced to inhabit. These narratives intersected in complex ways, influencing self-concept, confidence, and social engagement. The capacity to reconcile these layers was a form of resilience, allowing individuals to maintain continuity of self while integrating new dimensions of identity. Community perception played a critical role in this ongoing transformation. Families and neighbors responded to returning women in ways that reflected admiration, skepticism, or caution. How the women navigated these perceptions could shape their social standing, influence marriage prospects, and determine their roles within households. Demonstrating competence, resilience, and emotional intelligence became key strategies for asserting agency and fostering acceptance. Recognition of survival and skill could transform perceptions from vulnerability to strength, reconfiguring social hierarchies and relationships. Over time, many women leveraged their experiences to create influence and authority within their communities. Knowledge of the land, resource management, and human behavior allowed them to contribute strategically to household economy, decision-making, and planning. Skills in mediation, negotiation, and observation enhanced their social authority, enabling them to participate meaningfully in shaping communal life. In this sense, the transformative effects of captivity extended beyond survivalty, became instruments of empowerment, shaping both personal trajectory and community dynamics. The long-term consequences also extended into generational effects. Children born after the return often inherited practical knowledge, storytelling traditions, and skills indirectly transmitted by their mothers. Lessons learned in captivity, adaptability, endurance, and observation became embedded in family culture, influencing approaches to work, survival, and social interaction. These intergenerational effects demonstrate how experiences once thought personal or isolated can ripple outward, shaping social and cultural patterns over decades. Physical health was another domain affected by captivity. The demands of survival, constant travel, physical labor, exposure to the elements often resulted in lasting adaptations in stamina, strength, and bodily awareness. Conversely, injuries, nutritional stress, and illness endured during captivity could leave enduring vulnerabilities, requiring ongoing management. Awareness of health, resourcefulness in care, and practical knowledge of herbal remedies or preventive strategies often persisted, further contributing to resilience and autonomy in daily life. To be a woman captured on the plains was to be thrust into the center of one of history's most dramatic cultural frontiers. It meant losing one world and being forced to navigate another. Some endured, some transformed. All carried stories that challenge the way we think about identity, conflict, and survival. And in listening to those stories today, we gain not just a glimpse of hardship, but a deeper understanding of how resilient people can be when history changes their lives overnight.